perhaps had the greatest influence, with few current sociologists denying his importance. This influence is found across different schools, including critical theory, interpretivism, and even within Marxism. His reputation amongst his contemporaries and subsequent sociologists alike is based upon the intellectual weight of his contributions in sociological histories of law, religion, and in particular, the rise of modern capitalism. It was also occasioned by his impassioned interventions in the politics of the university and its role in public life, as well as the wider politics of the time. Weber's life spanned the unification of Germany under the dominance of Prussia and the Reich's Chancellor, Bismarck, in 1871, together with its territorial expansion and consolidation to the east in Europe and into Africa and the Pacific. In the 10 years preceding unification, this also involved wars with Denmark, Austria and France, while expansion into territories at a distance would involve conflict with other European empires. This culminated in the 1914-18 war among European powers that brought the short-lived German Empire to an end, with its overseas empire divided between other European powers, including Britain and France. The key conceptual frameworks bequeathed by Weber to contemporary sociology are associated with the rise of modern capitalism, the theory of forms of legitimate domination in the modern state, as well as core concepts of action, social relationships, and the methodology of ideal types. These were all formed in the context of Weber's engagement with issues of empire and German national interests in its competition with other imperial states, even if this is rarely directly acknowledged in the secondary literature. Indeed, Weber's orientation to Germany's national interest, his concern with the implications of different forms of economic organisation, and the role of religion in the rise of capitalism were deeply interconnected. In his Freiburg address, for example, he expressed his concern about the role of aristocratic German landowners in Prussia, the Junkers, where the economic backwardness of the larger states, including plantations growing sugar beet, was displacing independent German peasants from the villages. One of Weber's specific prescriptions for the situation in Prussia was to encourage modes of internal colonization and settlement through the creation of peasant smallholdings for native Germans in these areas, thereby reinforcing the borders of the German state and the dominance of native Germans over the local and Catholic Polish population. The concern to Germanify the Polish population in the eastern lands also coincided with similar policies towards Jewish people settled in these contested areas. The concern with national greatness and the problem of cultural backwardness associated with race or religion were part of the context for Weber's famous study of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In effect, he argued that modern capitalism was a specific and historically delimited form of economic activity whose existence could not follow simply from universal human motivations such as self-interest. According to Weber, its development depended upon the conjunction of two sets of factors, those of favourable material conditions alongside the emergence of a specific motivational disposition, what he called the spirit of capitalism. In order for this explanation to have force, Weber needed to distinguish the motivation of modern capitalism in something other than greed, or a simple orientation to wealth and profit. The focus of his study was to show how a specific, systematic and rational orientation to economic activity emerged within Protestantism. While religion tends to be understood as involving a turn away from this world in contemplation of the next, Weber made the argument that Protestantism, albeit unintentionally, facilitated the emergence and development of capitalist spirit and a thoroughly this-worldly orientation to economic life. His account has a number of important consequences. First, it served to make modern capitalism a consequence of a uniquely European cultural development, one that was also associated with a particular European personality. The spirit of capitalism was also a spirit of freedom. Second, his argument implied that capitalism could be exported. While other places may not have initiated the spirit of capitalism, once initiated in Europe, it could be developed elsewhere as an adjunct of the export of capitalism's social structures. This has become the substance of the recent sociological theory of multiple modernities, which argues for an originary European modernity and a diversity of adopted forms inflected by local cultural traditions. The modern capitalism that Weber addressed, however, was strongly associated with colonialism. This included internal colonialism, in terms of reinforcing Germany's eastern borders through settlement and the reinforcement of German identity against ethnic Poles and Jews. It also included external colonialism, in terms of German expansion into Africa and the Pacific region. It is further implicit in the very organisation of Weber's Protestant ethic study. The spirit of capitalism, for example, is associated with settler colonialism in the US via the figure of Benjamin Franklin. Weber is careful to establish that Franklin was a proto-capitalist, but he was, of course, first and foremost an assiduous colonist. As such, it was colonial predation, not piety, nor even capitalism, that was unleashed globally by what Lebowitz calls rapacious and rebellious men of wealth. Indeed, the counterfactual arguments subsequently developed by Weber to reinforce the claims of the Protestant ethic study that China experienced the favourable material conditions for the development of modern capitalism but failed to do so because of the retardant effects of Confucianism was flawed. China, in common with other countries of a high level of economic development, such as India, experienced the deliberate destruction of domestic manufacture by European colonists at the same time as being forcibly opened for trade, as in the Opium Wars of the 1840s and later. If we move to look at Weber's definition of the state as a form of political association that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, we see that it is one of the most commonly accepted definitions in the social sciences. The period that is assigned to the emergence of the modern state, however, is precisely that period of expansion that saw these states consolidate their domination over other parts of the world. Yet this external domination is not theorized as a constitutive aspect of the state, which instead of being understood as an imperial state, is presented in national terms. The German Empire may only have lasted 30 years, from 1884 to 1915, but imperialism was a constitutive aspect of the project of nation-state formation as identified by Weber himself. Nations, he argued, were not defined only in terms of ethnic or cultural homogeneity, but through the welding into a group of a people defined by their shared political destinies and struggles for power. A division between domestic populations, to whom the claim for legitimacy is made, and overseas populations, where domination must be acceded to as fact, is evident. It is an unacknowledged schism within Weber's conceptualization of the state. Imperial actions have to be justified at home, and part of that justification is the economic dividend that empire affords the nation, and those it recognizes as citizens. What is at issue in addressing neglected colonial histories is not simply a matter of substance, that is, of new, or at least newly understood histories. It is also the matter of sociological method. That is, can these new histories be made to make a difference to our previous understandings? And how might those understandings change more fundamentally as a consequence of taking different histories seriously? Following the themes of this module, is the question of colonialism an explanatory issue or just an issue of value relevance? Is it only because people from formerly colonized countries have entered the Western academy and public sphere that colonialism becomes an issue within it? Can the world of scholarship change without involving explanatory issues? If there are explanatory issues, they necessarily imply the need for reconstruction and learning. In the case of Weber, it is a process of understanding how a colonial mentality infuses his account of capitalism and political legitimacy, and yet how each concept is abstracted from its colonial context.